What about the public attitude held by millions of everyday Americans? All I've got on a computer is pictures of my family, CCTV cameras that are prevalent in a ton of American cities and overseas capitals. Those cameras are your friend if you're innocent and have nothing to hide.
Well, I'd say that's very much what the average Chinese citizen believed, or perhaps even still to this day believes. But we see how these same technologies are being applied to create what they call the social credit system. If any of these family photos, if any of your activities online, if your purchases, if your associations, if your friends are in any way different from what the government or the powers that be of the moment would like them to be, you're no longer able to purchase train tickets. You're no longer able to board an airplane. You may not be able to get a passport. You may not be eligible for a job. You might not be able to work for the government. All of these things are increasingly being created and programmed and decided by algorithms. And those algorithms are fueled by precisely the innocent data that our devices are creating all of the time, constantly, invisibly, quietly, right now. Our devices are casting all of these records that we do not see being created, that in aggregate seem very innocent. You were at Starbucks at this time. You went to the hospital afterwards. You spent a long time at the hospital. After you left the hospital, you made a phone call. You made a phone call to your mother. You talked to her until the middle of the night. The hospital was an oncology clinic. Even if you can't see the content of these communications, the activity records, what the government calls metadata, which they argue they do not need a warrant to collect, tells the whole story. And these activity records are being created and shared and collected and intercepted constantly by companies and governments. And ultimately it means as they sell these, as they trade these, as they make their businesses on the backs of these records, what they are selling is not information. What they're selling is us. They're selling our future. They're selling our past. They are selling our history, our identity, and ultimately, they are stealing our power and making our stories work for them.
What devices do you use in your life now, and have you accepted the notion that you are watched rather constantly?
Well, probably every intelligence in the world is definitely targeting me and trying to learn anything they can, just as they did with Jamal Khashoggi, in regards to what are my plans and intentions. I try not to make that easy for them. If I get a smartphone and I need to use a phone, I actually open it up before I use it. I perform a kind of surgery on it to physically desolder or sort of melt the metal connections that hold the microphone on the phone. And I physically take this off. I remove the camera for the phone, and then I close it back up, I seal it up. And then if I need to make a phone call, I will attach an external microphone on it. And this is just so if the phone is sitting there and I'm not making a call, it cannot hear me. Now, this is extreme. Most people do not need this. But for me, it's about being able to trust our technology. My phone could still be hacked. My laptop could still be hacked. And just as I told you before, the same principles apply to me. If it is hacked, they can do anything to the device that I can do. So my trust in technology is limited. But just because that's how it is today doesn't mean that's how it has to be. And a large majority of my work with the Freedom of the Press Foundation, where I serve as president of the board, is dedicated to trying to make technology more secure, to try to create programs and protocols by which we can make the communications of sources and journalists more confidential. Because if we lose the confidentiality between sources and journalists, we lose access to those essential facts that let us understand what's happening in the world. And unfortunately, under this White House, just like under the prior White House, we see the sources of very important stories that have advanced the public interest facing retaliation from a very angry government.
I believe it's in the first half of the book, and I'm paraphrasing, you come out and just say, the computer guy knows everything, or at least he should. What part computer guy were you, and what part trained spy?
Well, for the vast majority of my career, I was what was called a systems engineer or a systems administrator. An administrator sort of maintains and expands a system that they have inherited, and a systems engineer sort of develops new projects, new capabilities for these systems roles. What this means in short was that all of the systems at the NSA and the CIA that I was put in charge of, I had total access to. And this is just what happens with a systems administrator. When you think about a computer system, who gives someone else access? Well, someone has to be the original authority that has access to everything. That was me. And so I would say the computer guy knows everything. That's not a boast. That's simply the way these systems are designed. That's the way they're structured. And this is very much a vulnerability, because it means that you have to trust this administrator will work to the good of the users. But what happens when the people using that network, the people constructing that network, are going against the benefit of the broader society? And this put me in a very interesting kind of conflicted position. I could do what the NSA wanted me to do, or I could do what the Constitution of the United States, the public of the United States, needed me to do, which was report that my agency had broken the law.
Do you regard yourself as a journalist these days?
I'm not. I have tremendous respect for journalists, but I try to keep a distance, particularly in this moment where so much of journalism is coming under attack. Because the government has a tremendous incentive to discredit me, to make people distrust me. And so if I hold myself out, if I start reporting stories, if I start talking to sources, if I try to start advancing what the public knows on a personal level, my reputation could sort of poison the well. Instead, I keep a distinction. What I do is I try to aid the work of journalism, but I'm not myself a journalist.
Your book is highly personal. Tell us about the price your then girlfriend, now wife, paid for your actions, and how you feel she was misportrayed in the eyes of the world when we got that first kind of thumbnail sketch of who she was.
So in the wake of the revelations of mass surveillance in 2013, this was suddenly the world's biggest story. In every country, they were talking about the same thing. And unfortunately, that meant that everyone who was connected to me in some way, they were also talking about, because they were trying to say who I was, where I came from. And this unfortunately meant that Lindsay, my lifelong partner, was intensely investigated, both by the FBI in the United States. She didn't know what I was doing. I could not tell her what I was doing, because if I had, they would have said she was an accessory to the crime. They would have said she was part of a criminal conspiracy, so long as she didn't immediately pick up the phone and say, help, help, someone's talking to a journalist. And so this meant that I couldn't tell her. She learned about what was going to happen the same way everybody else did, or rather what is happening, the same way everybody else did. She saw me on TV, which probably makes me the worst boyfriend in the history of the United States. But she stuck by me, and we are reunited and together today. And I will never be able to repay her for the faith that she's shown me. But the media had a tremendous amount of salacious reporting. When they realized that she taught pole fitness classes, which are quite popular for women these days, they called her a stripper, even though she's never been one. Even though she's a poet, even though she's a photographer, they sexualized her. They focused on her body. They focused on her image, because that's what got attention. She is a much more complex and deep figure than the media ever gave her credit for. She is more brave than anyone can possibly understand. And she's more political and intelligent than any of these reporters at the time could appreciate. Her politics, in fact, influenced mine. And I'd like to think I learned as much from her, or perhaps even more, than she ever learned from me.
You paint a portrait of what some of us knew, and that was that you were a thoroughly American kid in your upbringing. You wake up every day in Russia. You go to sleep every night in Russia. Are you actively seeking to get out? Are you, as has been reported, looking for asylum elsewhere?
Well, this is not an actively seeking. This is not a new thing. And this is important history, especially for those people who don't like me, for those people who doubt me, who have heard terrible things about me. It was never my intention to end up in Russia. I was going to Latin America, and my final destination was hopefully going to be Ecuador. When the United States government heard that I had left Hong Kong, where I met the journalists, they canceled my passport. They gave press conferences about it, which meant I wasn't allowed to board my ongoing flight, which was going to take me to Latin America. Rather than applying for Russian asylum, rather than saying, I'll play ball with any Russian intelligence service, just please protect me, I said, no, I will not cooperate with the Russian government or any government. Instead, what I did, as I was trapped for 40 days in an airport, I don't know what your longest layover is, but 40 days was a tough stint. I applied for asylum in 27 different countries around the world, traditional U.S. allies, places like France and Germany, places like Norway, that I felt the U.S. government and the American public could be comfortable that was fine for a whistleblower to be in. And yet every time one of these governments got close to opening their doors, the phone would ring, and they're in their foreign ministries. And on the other end of the line would be a very senior American official. It was one of two people, then Secretary of State John Kerry or then Vice President Joe Biden. And they would say, look, we don't care what the law is. We don't care if you can do this or not. We understand that protecting whistleblowers and granting asylum is a matter of human rights, and you could do this if you want to. But if you protect this man, if you let this guy out of Russia, there will be consequences. We're not going to say what they're going to be, but there will be a response. I continue to this day to say, look, if the United States government, if these countries are willing to open the door, that is not a hostile act. That is the act of a friend. If anything, if the United States government is so concerned about Russia, right, shouldn't they be happy for me to leave? And yet we see they're trying so hard to prevent me from leaving. I would ask you, why is that?
I'm guessing Joe Biden is not your candidate for 2020?
Actually, I don't take a position on the 2020 race. Look, it's a difficult position, being in the executive branch. It's a difficult position, being in power, and you have to make unpopular decisions. I would like to think, having seen now in 2019 that all of the allegations against me did not come true. National security was not harmed as a result of these disclosures. But they did win the Pulitzer Prize for public service journalism. The laws were changed as a result. The courts said these programs were unconstitutional. We live in a safer and more secure world because the internet is safer and more secure as a result of understanding these common vulnerabilities, which not just U.S. intelligence agencies were exploiting, but our adversaries were exploiting. When we close these holes, we do not become more vulnerable, we become more secure. In 2013, it's fair to say, some of these officials, some of these candidates could go, oh, the intelligence services are saying this guy's dangerous. They're saying this is a risk. They're saying this shouldn't have happened. In 2019, we can see that no evidence has ever been presented that the public understanding mass surveillance is real, has caused any kind of harm whatsoever. No one has died. No terrorist attacks have succeeded because we knew about this stuff. These programs work regardless of whether or not you know about them. But we have seen the public benefits substantiated year after year after year. And so I'd like to think these people would reevaluate their position.
You know, there are government officials who would push back very strong on your assertion that national security was not harmed. You chose not to stop with your revelations at what was being done to Americans, and you got into America and its allies and perceived enemies.
When we're looking at the reports that were published in 2013, it's important to understand I never published a single story. The number of documents that I revealed is 0. What I did was I collected an archive of material showing criminality or unethical or unconstitutional behavior on the part of the United States government. I provided this archive to journalists who were required as a condition of access to this material not to publish any story because it's interesting. They could publish no story simply because it's newsworthy. They were only allowed, so far as the agreement went, to publish stories that they were willing to stand up and say were in the public interest to know. And this is not some crazy fly-by-night organization. These are newspapers like the Washington Post, like the New York Times, like the Guardian. And in every case, this process was followed. Now, as an extraordinary check on top of this, in case I went too far, in case I collected a document that was too hot, or I misunderstood things, or the journalists misunderstood things, the journalists were further required to go to the government in advance of publication, and they were required to do this at my request and warn the government. This is the story that we're going to run. This is what it's about. This is what we're going to say. So the government could argue against it to create an adversarial check on what the journalists and I were trying to do, to reconstruct the system of checks and balances in the United States that had itself failed in the government. And because that process was followed so scrupulously, that's why I am so confident that no harm happened, no harm occurred. Now, if there are those in the government that say harm took place, if there are those in the government who say people have died, I ask you this: why haven't they proved it? You know better than anyone, Brian, that these government officials are more than happy to pick up a phone and make a leak to the New York Times every day of the week. If they had some evidence that somebody was hurt, if they had evidence that a terrorist attack got through because of this journalism, it would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world. And despite 6 years of history, that's never happened.
Describe your life today. What is every day like? How are you supporting yourself? And as a simple equation, if the Russians have reached so effectively into our lives and our electoral systems, they must be all over your life.
So that was several different questions. But yeah, I'm sure the Russian government is trying to spy on me. I'm sure the United States government is trying to spy on me. Everyone's trying to spy on me. The thing is, I don't cooperate with them. My allegiance is to my country. My allegiance is to my Constitution. Now, in terms of my daily life, it's actually pretty ordinary, which is to say it's not so interesting. I've always been something of an indoor cat, right? I'm not going to nightclubs and partying. My life since I was a child has always been mediated by a screen. That's by choice. So not much actually changes in my day-to-day, whether I'm living in New York or Berlin or Moscow. In terms of my work, which a lot of people are curious about, this, I think, is a polite way of people asking, do you work for the Russian government? Do you accept money from the Russian government? You know, are you living in Russian government housing? Are you in a bunker? Are there guards? And of course, the answer to all of these is no. No, I'm not. What I do for a living is speak professionally, and now I'm actually an author. I have a speakers bureau. It's called the American Program Bureau, and you can call them and you can book a public event. I speak at universities, I speak at corporate events, I speak at cybersecurity conferences to talk to people about what is happening on the internet. What is the future of surveillance, and how can we protect ourselves? I'm very fortunate to have had that opportunity, and it's meant that I've had a quite comfortable life in quite a difficult position.
The former White House aide H.R. Haldeman left us with an expression for the ages, and when he said, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. For Americans who feel that this is just a behemoth, that there's no way they could have any control over it, for Americans who long ago decided we're just going to have to live with this surveillance, how could it possibly be receded or rescinded or stopped?
We can stop a program. We can thwart an attack. We can make a device more secure. But as you imply, the system is still there. The institutions and agencies and companies that produced these attacks, that are creating new methods of spying every day, will still be there. The fundamental change, not just in the United States, but around the world, that has to happen is we have to stop thinking about the limitations on how data is used as data protection regulations. Right now, when we talk about what Google and Facebook are doing, right now when we talk about what the NSA is doing, right now when we talk about what rival governments are doing, what the Russians are doing, what the Chinese are doing, what the North Koreans and the Iranians are doing, we're constantly thinking about, all right, this data has been collected and these companies have it. How do we regulate their use? Regulating the use is a mistake. We should do that, but that's the wrong focus. It is the collection of data that is the problem. When you start trying to regulate use, you're going, the collection has already happened. The collection was already legal. One of the fundamental flaws in U.S. privacy legislation is the fact that we are one of the only advanced democracies in the world that does not have any basic privacy law whatsoever. We have the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which is the reason that I came forward. But that restricts what the federal government can do. That restricts what the state governments can do. It doesn't restrict what companies can do. And as you know, as everybody knows, these companies are playing a bigger and bigger part in the world today. We have to say, all of these records that they're creating about all of us, all of this control that they're developing from these surveillance programs, whether they're saying they're doing it for targeting advertisements or whether they're doing it for targeting killings, these records belong to the people that they are about, not to the companies. And this is a fundamental change that we have never discussed in a meaningful way, broadly and publicly, but we have to. Because all of these governments have said, you know, the mass surveillance system, why do we have it? Why is it useful? They say because of terrorism. They say it's saving lives. They say it's preventing attacks. But no less than Barack Obama, in response to the 2013 revelations, created 2 independent commissions to investigate exactly the answer to that question. Were these programs effective in stopping terrorist attacks? Did these revelations cause harm to national security? It was called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies. And despite having an enormous budget, despite having complete access to classified information, despite the fact that they interviewed the heads of the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, you know, the full alphabet soup, they found, in the government's own words, the kind of mass surveillance that's represented by this bulk collection program where the NSA was secretly collecting the phone records of every American and everybody else around the world every day under an authority provided by a secret court order that nobody even knew existed. That program had never made, their own words, a concrete difference in a single counterterrorism investigation. Think about that. More than 10 years of operation in secret never made a single concrete difference. These programs, mass surveillance, is not about public safety. It is not about terrorism. It is about power. It is about economic espionage. It is about diplomatic manipulation. And it is about social influence. It is about understanding the actions of everyone in the world as carefully as they can, no matter who they are, no matter how innocent their life.
Final question has to do with the Fourth Amendment. We have it today because Mr. Adams and others wanted to keep the British out of their homes and their horse carriages. What would Mr. Adams and the founders make of the reach of the government, in your view, into our lives, given its humble beginnings?
I think if any of the founders of this country looked around today, they would be shocked by the kind of rhetoric they hear, and they would be shocked by the kind of activities of government they see. If you read the Bill of Rights, something that struck me when I was writing about it in this book was that fully half of the first 10 amendments are explicitly making the work of government harder. They're making life for law enforcement officials harder. And all of the Founding Fathers thought that was a good idea because they recognized the more efficient a government is, the more dangerous it is. We want a government always that is not too efficient. We want a government always that is just efficient enough, because government holds extraordinary power in our lives. We want government always to be using their powers in a way that is only necessary and proportionate to the threat presented by whoever it is that they're investigating. When the government is getting by the skin of their teeth, the people are free, right? The government should be afraid of the people. People shouldn't be afraid of the government. One of the ironies about the Founding Fathers, for those who are skeptical of me, which is fair, again, I don't want you to trust me. I want you to doubt me. I want you to question me. But I want you to look at the facts. I want you to look beyond how you feel in the moment, how we all feel in the moment, and see what these stories said in 2013. See that the courts of the United States, where I'm being charged as a criminal, said that the government itself was engaged in criminal activity. Look at these things and then remember, the people who founded this country were called traitors. The signing, the writing of the Declaration of Independence was an outrageous act of treason. It was criminal, but it was also right. The question of whether or not I broke the law is less difficult and less interesting than whether you think what I did was right or wrong. What is legal is not always the same as what is moral.
Final prediction, then we'll let you go night clubbing, and that is, do you predict you will at some point live out your life and die in the United States?
I think I will return. When we look at the kind of things that were being said about me in 2013, the kind of hostility I faced, the kind of accusations I faced from the most senior officials in government, and we look at the world today, yes, there are many still who don't like me, but far, far fewer, because we have seen that all of the harms that they alleged over the course of these years never came to pass. They were never substantiated because they don't exist. But the benefits are becoming more clear with each passing year. The question that I think people have to answer, whether you like me as a person or not, right? Whether you agree with how I did what I did, whether you agree with the work of the journalists who decided what the public should know in order to cast their votes. Today, you know the government broke the law. Today, you know the United States government had violated the Constitution and the rights of people in this country and around the world. Would you rather not know? Thank you.
Ed Snowden, thank you very much. Good luck with the book.
It's my pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.